December 7th, 1941. At District, Tokyo, Japan. Through his office window, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto could see the Imperial Palace grounds bathed in morning light. Celebrations erupted in the streets below as news of the Pearl Harbor attack spread through the capital. In the past 12 hours, Japanese carrier planes had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 2,400 Americans dead, 350 aircraft destroyed. The attack had been a tactical masterpiece. Japanese naval aviators had achieved complete surprise, executing their mission with extraordinary skill and courage. Yet Yamamoto sat alone in his office, consumed by dread rather than triumph. While military leaders and government officials celebrated what they believed was a decisive blow against American naval power, Yamamoto understood a truth that would haunt him until his death. This attack, which seemed like Japan's greatest victory, would prove to be the catalyst for Japan's inevitable defeat. He had spent years in America, more time than any senior Japanese military officer of his generation. He had walked through the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where blast furnaces produced more steel in a single day than some Japanese mills produced in a month. He had driven past the endless automobile factories of Detroit, witnessing assembly lines that churned out vehicles with mechanical precision that Japanese industry could not match. He had seen the agricultural abundance of California's Central Valley, where farms produced food surpluses that fed millions. While Japanese agriculture struggled to feed its own population, he knew what his fellow officers refused to believe. America possessed industrial capacity that defied Japanese comprehension. The mathematics of war that his colleagues celebrated would soon become the mathematics of Japan's doom. What none of them understood, what they could not accept, even when confronted with evidence, was that this attack would trigger the most rapid industrial mobilization in human history. A transformation so complete that within 6 months, American production would shatter every assumption Japanese war planners had made about their enemy's capabilities. The sleeping giant metaphor that would later become associated with this moment was apocryphal, but the sentiment was real. America, once aroused to fury, would prove unstoppable. The collapse of Japanese strategic assumptions began not with a military defeat, but with a single presidential speech. 1942, 30 days after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver his State of the Union address. He announced production goals that Japanese intelligence officers monitoring the speech would later dismiss as propaganda, impossible targets designed purely for American morale. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 more in 1943. Roosevelt was announcing a 2-year production program, but even understood correctly, the targets seemed fantastical. To put these numbers in context, Japan had produced approximately 5,000 aircraft in 1941. America had built approximately 19,000 military aircraft that same year, nearly 4 times Japanese output even before mobilization began. The gap was already substantial, but Roosevelt was demanding production increases that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. Consider the mathematics. Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 12 times what Japan had produced in 1941, and more than 3 times what America itself had built. The entire Japanese aircraft industry, operating at maximum capacity with every factory running multiple shifts, produced roughly the same output as a single American state. Japanese military planners simply could not conceive of industrial capacity on the scale Roosevelt was describing. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this possibility. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, he had held a secret conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaru Kono. The exact timing of this meeting remains disputed by historians, with sources citing dates ranging from early 1940 to November 1941. But the substance of Yamamoto's warning is well documented. If we are ordered to do it, I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. The Admiralty had ignored his warning. The Army General Staff had dismissed his caution as weakness, as defeatism unsuitable for a warrior. They believed American society was too soft, too divided, too decadent to mobilize for total war. They pointed to American isolationism, labor disputes, racial tensions, and political divisions as evidence that America lacked the unity and discipline necessary for modern warfare. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the American industrial machine began a transformation that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare and establish new standards for national mobilization. The War Production Board was established on January 16, 1942, exactly 40 days after the attack. Chairman Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive with no military experience, received authority unprecedented in American peacetime history. He could commandeer factories, redirect raw materials, set production quotas, transform entire industries overnight. His power derived from the War Powers Act was nearly absolute in matters of industrial production. The speed of conversion stunned even American observers who understood their nation's industrial capacity. General Motors, the world's largest automobile manufacturer and a corporate giant that epitomized American industrial prowess, produced its last civilian car on February 10, 1942, 64 days after Pearl Harbor. The vehicle, a Chevrolet sedan, rolled off the assembly line at noon. By midnight, the same assembly line was being reconfigured for tank production. By March 1st, the massive Willow Run plant outside Detroit, purpose-built by Ford to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers, had begun production. The plant was so large that it had its own railway system, its own power plant, and its own fire department. At peak production, Willow Run produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, every major automobile manufacturer in America ceased civilian production entirely. These factories, which had produced 4.5 million cars in 1941, feeding America's appetite for personal transportation and symbolizing the American way of life, would produce exactly 0 civilian vehicles for the duration of the war. Instead, they built tanks, aircraft engines, artillery shells, machine guns, and military vehicles in quantities that Japanese planners had calculated were mathematically impossible given America's pre-war industrial base. The automobile industry's conversion provides a window into American industrial flexibility. A factory that had built car engines could, with relatively minor retooling, build aircraft engines. You had assembled transmissions could learn to assemble tank driver trains. The fundamental industrial infrastructure, the machine tools, the trained workforce, the management systems, the supply chains could be redirected toward military production with stunning speed. Japanese military production existed in dedicated facilities that could not easily be converted or expanded. When a Japanese aircraft factory was damaged by bombing, it could not be quickly rebuilt or replaced. When American factories were operating at capacity, new factories were built in months. The scale of American production began overwhelming Japanese expectations almost immediately. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 military aircraft, falling short of Roosevelt's ambitious goal of 60,000, but still nearly 10 times Japan's annual output of approximately 5,000. By 1943, production reached 85,000 aircraft, missing Roosevelt's target of 125,000, but still representing more aircraft than existed in the entire world just a decade earlier. These were not just fighters and bombers. They included transport aircraft, reconnaissance planes, trainer aircraft, gliders, and specialized types that Japan was not producing in any significant numbers. By 1944, American aircraft production peaked at 96,000 units. By war's end in 1945, cumulative American production reached 297,000 military aircraft. Japan, mobilizing its entire industrial base for war production and accepting drastic civilian privation, built 85,611 aircraft during the entire war from 1941 to 1945. The American to Japanese production ratio was more than 3, one sustained across 4 years of maximum effort by both nations. The disparity was not merely quantitative. It was categorical, representing fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. America was fighting a war of material abundance, accepting that some aircraft would be lost to accidents, mechanical failures, or enemy action, but knowing they could be replaced faster than they were destroyed. Japan was fighting a war of scarcity, carefully husbanding resources, unable to replace losses, watching their numerical strength decline month by month, regardless of tactical victories achieved. But the transformation went far beyond simple numbers on production chart. It represented a fundamental reorganization of American society that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. Boeing's Seattle plant provides an illustrative example. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the facility employed 4,000 workers producing aircraft at a modest pace. By the war's peak, the plant employed 30,000 workers operating 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. The workforce had increased 7-fold in less than 3 years. Similar expansions occurred at every major defense contractor across America. Where did these workers come from? From every segment of American society. Women who had comprised less than 1% of aircraft industry workers before the war made up over 10% by mid-1942. By March 1943, women comprised 30% of aviation manufacturing employees. By 1945, women made up 65% of the aircraft industry workforce in some facilities. The iconic Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda. She was economic reality representing millions of women who left homes and entered factories to support the war effort. These women were not merely supplemental labor filling clerical roles or light assembly work. They were primary workers performing every task previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages, riveted wing sections, assembled complex engines, operated heavy machinery, read blueprints, performed quality control inspections. They worked swing shifts and graveyard shifts. They raised children, managed households, and worked 48-hour weeks in defense plants. Without them, American production goals would have been impossible to achieve. African Americans systematically excluded from skilled industrial work in peacetime America through both formal discrimination and informal barriers, found new employment opportunities in defense plants. Executive Order 8802 signed by Roosevelt in June 1941 prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. While discrimination certainly continued in practice, the manpower demands of total war forced American industry to tap labor pools previously excluded. By 1945, over 1 million African Americans worked in defense industries, gaining skills, earning wages, and developing expectations of equality that would fuel the post-war civil rights movement. Teenagers left high schools to work in factories with special programs allowing students to work half days while continuing education. The elderly came out of retirement, bringing experience and work ethic to factories desperate for skilled labor. Disabled individuals found employment in positions suited to their capabilities. The massive labor mobilization drew upon every available person in American society. By 1944, over 18 million Americans worked in defense-related industries, nearly 1 in 7 people in the entire nation. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial capacity and innovative manufacturing approaches. These cargo vessels, designed to be built quickly with semi-skilled labor using standardized components, began rolling off production lines at unprecedented rates. The most famous example was the SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. This record was deliberately set as an incentive demonstration with experienced workers, stockpiled materials, and special preparations. It was far faster than normal construction times, which averaged 42 to 50 days per ship. But even the normal pace was remarkable by historical standards. Ships that previously took months to build were being launched in weeks. At peak production in 1943, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships per day, 18 merchant vessels per week, 75 per month. By war's end, America would produce 27 10 Liberty ships, each one carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, together representing more shipping capacity than existed in the entire Japanese merchant marine at the war's start. Japan's entire merchant ship construction program, operating at maximum wartime capacity, produced approximately 15 ships per month at peak. The disparity was overwhelming and strategically decisive. Consider the strategic implications of this shipping disparity. America could sustain military operations across two oceans, simultaneously supplying forces in Europe and the Pacific, maintaining civilian prosperity at home, and sending massive aid to allies, including Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Japan could barely maintain supply lines to its own frontline forces and saw its merchant marine systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to approximately 10% of its pre-war tonnage, strangling Japanese industry of raw materials and military forces of supplies. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory became clear to any analyst willing to examine production statistics objectively. But Japanese military leadership refused to acknowledge reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, wrote in his diary in March 1942, "Barely 3 months into the war, we achieved tactical surprise, but I fear we have guaranteed strategic defeat. The Americans are not collapsing as we predicted. They are building. They are angry. They are unified." His concerns were noted by superiors, and Genda was quietly removed from strategic planning duties. The military leadership did not want officers who questioned inevitable victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the first significant check to Japanese expansion. For the first time since the war began, a Japanese invasion force was turned back without achieving its objectives. The Imperial Japanese Navy had planned to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, establishing air bases within striking distance of Australia and completing Japan's defensive perimeter. American and Australian naval forces intercepted the invasion fleet, leading to history's first aircraft carrier battle, where opposing ships never came within visual range of each other. The tactical results were roughly even. The light carrier was sunk and the fleet carrier Shukaku was badly damaged. When American forces cut Japanese supply lines, Japanese troops often found themselves immobilized and starving. American forces with abundant trucks and well-organized supply chains maintained operational tempo and combat effectiveness, even in remote locations. American shipyards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels during the war, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels. Japan completed fewer than 1,000 naval vessels. The disparity was overwhelming in every category. America built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers after Midway. America built over 400 destroyer escorts for convoy protection. Japan built fewer than 70 escort vessels. America launched approximately 200 submarines. Japan built approximately 170, but American submarines proved far more effective in commerce raiding and ultimately destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. The submarine war in the Pacific demonstrates how industrial capacity translated directly into strategic results. American submarines operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later the Philippines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 60% of all Japanese merchant vessels and 30% of the Japanese Navy. This maritime blockade starved Japanese industry of oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines, and food from throughout the empire. Japan's war economy collapsed not from lack of will, but from lack of raw materials that could no longer be transported safely. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, less than 10% remained operational. Japan could not replace these losses because shipyards were operating at reduced capacity due to material shortages and bomb damage. America was building merchant ships faster than Japanese submarines could possibly sink them, and Japanese submarines focused on warships rather than merchant vessels anyway. A strategic mistake that squandered one of Japan's few potentially effective weapons. But raw numbers only partially explained the industrial chasm that separated the combatants. American production was not merely larger in scale. It was fundamentally different in character, representing a level of industrial integration, technological sophistication, and organizational efficiency that Japan could not match with available resources and technology. The B-29 Superfortress bomber exemplifies this difference better than any other single-weapons system. The B-29 was designed specifically to strike Japan from distant bases, addressing the strategic problem of how to attack Japanese home islands when carriers could not safely operate in range and island bases were not yet available. Boeing designed the aircraft to carry heavy bomb loads across 3,000 mi distances at altitudes above 30,000 ft, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively operate. The resulting aircraft was the most complex bomber of World War II, and possibly the most sophisticated production aircraft built by any nation during the war. Each B-29 contained 40,540 different parts, from massive engine components to tiny electrical switches. The aircraft consumed 12 tons of aluminum in its construction, along with substantial quantities of copper, steel, rubber, and exotic materials like magnesium that Japan could barely obtain. 4 Wright R3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, powered the bomber to operating speeds of 350 mph at 30,000 ft altitude. The pressurized cabin allowed crew members to operate in normal clothing rather than bulky heated flight suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets aimed by sophisticated analog computers provided defensive armament. The B-29 carried up to 20,000 lb of bombs, equivalent to the total bomb load of 20 fighters across distances of 3,000 mi. It struck targets that had previously been safe from air attack, bringing war directly to Japanese cities and industry. America would build approximately 4,000 of these bombers between 1943 and 1945. Each one represented industrial capacity and technological sophistication that exceeded Japan's entire aircraft industry output. The fact that America could produce 4,000 B-29s while simultaneously building thousands of fighters, medium bombers, transports, and other aircraft types reveals the scale of American industrial mobilization. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated both American production capacity and the futility of Japanese resistance once American industry reached full mobilization. The campaign began in earnest in November 1944 when B-29 bombers based in the Marana Islands began regular attacks on Japanese industrial targets. Initial raids used high-altitude precision bombing, attempting to destroy specific factories. Results were disappointing due to weather navigation difficulties and Japan's dispersed industrial base. In March 1945, Major General Curtis Lane changed tactics, ordering low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids against Japanese cities. The results were devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945 employed 334 B-29 bombers, carrying 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs designed to start uncontrollable fires in densely packed wooden structures. The attack created a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more casualties than would result from the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The firestorm created temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees F, hot enough to boil water in canals and melt glass. People who sought refuge in water were boiled alive. Those who remained in buildings were incinerated. Those who fled into streets were suffocated by smoke or consumed by fire. The destruction was comprehensive and horrifying, exceeding anything that conventional bombing had previously achieved. Yet, this massive raid, which killed more people than any other single air attack in history up to that point, represented only a fraction of American bombing capability. Within weeks, similar raids struck Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities throughout Japan. By summer 1945, Japan's major urban areas had been systematically destroyed. American bombers were dropping leaflets warning specific cities of impending attacks, then returning days later to destroy them exactly as promised. This psychological warfare demonstrated that Japan had lost not only the physical capacity to defend itself, but also the ability to protect civilians from assault. Japanese fighter defenses, already depleted by years of attrition, could not prevent American bombers from operating with near impunity over Japanese territory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, occurring exactly 2 years after Midway, demonstrated how completely American production had overcome Japanese tactical skill. The battle occurred during the American invasion of the Mariana Islands, strategically vital because their capture would place B-29 bombers within range of Japan. The Japanese Navy launched Operation Ago, committing 9 carriers and supporting vessels in an attempt to destroy American carrier forces and prevent the Marianas' invasion. Which had been the world's finest in 1941, had been systematically destroyed through 2 years of attrition warfare. Experienced pilots killed in earlier battles have been replaced by hastily trained recruits with minimal flight time and no combat experience. These new pilots flying against American carrier groups that had expanded exponentially since Midway were slaughtered in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft launched massive strikes against American carriers. This was partly cultural, reflecting traditional gender roles that were even more rigid than in pre-war America, but also practical. Japanese factories did not have labor surpluses to recruit from because Japanese men were not being drafted in numbers comparable to American mobilization. Japan simply lacked the population base and industrial capacity to fight both a total war and maintain industrial production at levels comparable to America. The Manhattan Project represented the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific capacity. A program so vast and so secret that few Americans knew it existed, even as it employed over 130,000 people. The project cost approximately $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese defense budget for some years of the war. The facilities constructed for the Manhattan Project were themselves industrial marvels. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was built from scratch in 1943 as a uranium enrichment facility. At peak operation, the facility consumed 1/17 of all electrical power generated in the United States, more than New York City. The electromagnetic separation equipment designed to separate fissionable uranium-235 from more common uranium-238 was manufactured by companies that normally produced commercial electrical equipment, but were converted to produce components for atomic weapons. Hanford, Washington, constructed simultaneously, produced plutonium in nuclear reactors that had never been operated at that scale before. The reactors required constant cooling with water from the Columbia River, processed in facilities that were the largest industrial installations in the Pacific Northwest. The entire operation was experimental, based on scientific principles that were barely understood and engineering on scales never attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico, served as the design laboratory where scientists and engineers designed the actual bombs. Robert Oppenheimer directed a team of brilliant scientists, many refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, working frantically to complete weapons before Germany developed them first. The irony, not known until after the war, was that Germany never came close to building atomic bombs. German atomic research had been abandoned in early 1942 after scientists calculated that weapons development would require resources Germany could not spare from conventional arms production. The scientific knowledge, engineering expertise, and industrial infrastructure required for the Manhattan Project existed nowhere else in the world. Britain had excellent scientists, but lacked industrial resources. The Soviet Union had brilliant theoreticians, but lacked the technological base. Germany had started ahead, but abandoned the effort. Japan had some of the world's best physicists, but lacked uranium, industrial capacity, and the organizational resources for a program of necessary scale. Only America possessed all required elements: scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, electrical power, rare materials, engineering expertise, financial resources, and above all, the organizational capability to coordinate efforts across dozens of sites involving hundreds of companies and over 130,000 workers. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, used uranium-235 and detonated with force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion killed approximately 70 to 80,000 people immediately and destroyed 4 square miles of the city. Tens of thousands more would die in subsequent weeks and months from radiation exposure and burns. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, used plutonium and detonated with slightly greater force, approximately 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The explosion killed approximately 40 to 60,000 people immediately in a city partially shielded by hills that limited blast effects. These attacks demonstrated conclusively that Japan could no longer protect its population from American assault. Emperor Hirohito, speaking publicly for the first time in Japanese history, announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. In his radio address, he cited the atomic bomb specifically as justification for surrender, stating that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship U.S. Missouri in Tokyo Bay, ending the Pacific War. The strategic analysis of Japan's defeat reveals that Pearl Harbor, far from being Japan's greatest victory, was actually the trigger for inevitable collapse. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this truth before the attack. His prediction of 6 months of success followed by mounting difficulties proved accurate almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, June 4th to 7th, precisely matching Yamamoto's timeline. From that moment forward, American industrial capacity made Japanese defeat mathematically certain regardless of courage, skill, or sacrifice displayed by Japanese forces. Japanese military planners had made several catastrophic miscalculations, each one compounding the others to create strategic disaster. First, they underestimated American industrial capacity by a factor of 10 or more. They knew America produced more than Japan, but fundamentally misunderstood the scale of potential American mobilization. Second, they assumed American society was too soft, too divided, too decadent to mobilize effectively for total war. They believed Americans loved comfort and would not accept sacrifices necessary for victory. Pearl Harbor proved them disastrously wrong, unifying American public opinion and creating determination to fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Third, Japanese planners believed military excellence could compensate for material inferiority. They assumed superior training, fighting spirit, and tactical skill would allow Japanese forces to achieve victory despite inferior numbers. This assumption ignored the mathematics of attrition warfare. Superior training matters in individual combat, but in industrial warfare involving millions of soldiers and tens of thousands of aircraft and ships, quantity has its own quality. American forces could accept losses, learn from mistakes, and return with improved equipment and fresh troops. Japanese forces could not replace losses and watch numerical strength decline month after month. Fourth, Japanese planners gambled that America would negotiate peace after early defeats rather than fight to unconditional surrender. They believed American casualties at Pearl Harbor, Philippines, and early battles would create public pressure for negotiated peace that would leave Japan controlling much of its conquered territory. They fundamentally misunderstood American political culture and the determination that Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had created. America fought to unconditional surrender, accepting whatever casualties proved necessary to achieve complete victory. They were wrong on every calculation, and each miscalculation was compounded by Japan's inability to adapt when reality contradicted assumptions. Military leadership, trained in a culture that valued spirit over material considerations, could not accept that industrial production mattered more than fighting spirit. They continued launching offensives even when losses were unsustainable, believing determination would somehow overcome mathematical reality. American production statistics tell the story of systematic industrial mobilization that defeated Japan as surely as bombs and bullets, 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks, approximately 6,800 naval vessels. These numbers represent production achieved while simultaneously fighting Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa, maintaining civilian standards of living far above subsistence levels, and actually expanding the American economy overall. Between 1941 and 1945, American gross national product increased by approximately 70%, while producing enough military equipment to supply not only American forces, but also substantial Allied forces including Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and Free French forces. Japan could not remotely approach this output even when devoting all resources to military production and accepting drastic civilian privation. By 1944, Japanese civilians were on subsistence rations. Cities were being evacuated to reduce food requirements. After that point, American production would overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer material superiority, regardless of Japanese courage or tactical skill. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway demonstrated the speed and completeness of American mobilization. It unified American public opinion, which had been divided between interventionists and isolationists, creating national consensus for total war that might have been impossible to achieve through normal political processes. Yet, within months, American industry transformed itself completely, achieving production levels that Japanese observers found literally incredible. Even when confronted with evidence, the speed of transformation exceeded anything Japanese planners had considered possible. The social changes they initiated, particularly regarding women's roles and racial equality, transformed American society fundamentally. Each month demonstrated that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible production goals were becoming reality. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American production through various sources struggled to believe their own reports. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they were real, verified, undeniable.